Halloween. Are you afraid of Halloween? Be careful, because what you're about to hear isn't just stories. This darkness, it will stay with you for a long time. So, do you dare to keep watching? On one cold Halloween night, 11-year-old Alex was returning home after spending time with his friends collecting candy. His house was an old, dilapidated one on the edge of town, surrounded by dense trees, and people tended to avoid getting too close due to the eerie stories told about it. When he opened the door, he felt that the air was colder than usual. Everything seemed strange. The lights flickered for a moment, and Alex hesitated. He then closed the door behind him and hurried to his room. He tried to convince himself that it was just exhaustion and that it was all in his imagination, but as he approached his room, he heard the sound of light footsteps getting closer down the hallway behind him. He held his breath, and his hand began to shake as he tried to ignore it. But with every step that came closer, the rustling sound grew louder, as though a slow-moving figure was following him. Alex stopped moving for a moment and looked around slowly. The hallway was empty, but the shadows were longer and heavier than they should have been. When he finally reached his room, he quickly shut the door and took a deep breath to calm himself. But at that same moment, he heard the sound of rustling. It was coming from behind the door of his wardrobe. He tried to convince himself that it was just small animals or the wind, but the sound persisted, as if it were coming from something much larger. Alex's trembling hand reached toward the wardrobe, slowly opening the door. Alex slowly opened the wardrobe door, his eyes wandering through the pitch-black darkness inside. At first, he saw nothing but his hanging clothes, but something felt strange. The clothes were swaying lightly, as if they were breathing. In that moment, Alex noticed something unusual. A pale, cold hand slowly emerging from the depths of the shadows within the wardrobe, turning toward his face with slow, heavy movements, as if it were searching for him. Alex took a step back, but his eyes couldn't look away from the outstretched hand. Suddenly, strange sounds came from behind him, whispering, muffled voices, as if people were speaking softly behind the walls of his room. A chill ran through him and he felt the cold invade his body, but there was something else, something he caught in his eye. It was a small mirror next to the wardrobe, but in it, he saw a reflection that was not his own. In the mirror, he saw a ghostly image of another child, pale-faced, standing behind him. The child's face was almost featureless, except for two completely black eyes. A small, terrifying smile spread across his faint lips, and his hands began to rise, as though preparing to wrap around Alex's neck. The ghostly child in the mirror was pointing at him with a finger, beckoning him to come closer to the mirror slowly. Alex was frozen in place with terror. Though he wanted to run, he felt an invisible force holding him still. As the whispers from the walls grew louder and the rustling from the wardrobe intensified, the ghost's smile deepened and darkened. Alex had completely lost his nerve, and with all the terror around him, he slowly backed toward the back door. But suddenly he saw something even more terrifying. There, in the corner of the dark room, stood an extremely tall figure, its body unnaturally thin, wearing a Halloween mask with a smiling face, but it was cracked, as if it were wearing another face over its real one. The mask was staring directly at Alex, its eyes behind the mask glowing with a frightening gleam, like those of a predatory animal. Alex stepped back, but tripped and fell to the floor, starting to scream. The masked figure began to move toward him slowly, with heavy footsteps, the sound of its shoes scraping the floor filling the room with a chilling echo. Alex, unable to control his fear, quickly got up and fled the house, running blindly through the dark suburban streets under the faint moonlight. He kept running, never looking back, as though trying to escape a living nightmare chasing him. Finally, he reached his grandmother's house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by massive, dense trees that evoked a sense of dread. The front door was slightly open, but he didn't see any sign of his grandmother. Alex began banging on the door violently, his eyes welling up with tears, his fingers trembling. He cried desperately, his voice shaky, "Grandma, please, open the door." But everything was still inside, and no sound came in response. All he could hear was the sound of footsteps drawing closer from behind him. Alex, after calling out for his grandmother with no response, suddenly felt something standing behind him. It was like a cold breath brushing against his neck, and his blood froze in his veins. He realized he had to turn around, even though every instinct inside him screamed to run. Slowly, Alex turned, his heart pounding fiercely, and found an incredibly strange creature before him. It was tall and thin, wearing a tattered black cloak, its face covered by a mask, half of it dark, the other half grinning in an unnatural smile. The eyes behind the mask were bulging, like those of a cursed doll, glowing with an eerie light. Without thinking, Alex screamed and grabbed whatever he could find, a vase beside him, and struck the strange creature with all his might. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, but the creature didn't move, didn't scream, and showed no sign of pain. It stood there, staring at Alex with a frozen gaze, then began to laugh, a muffled and ominous laugh, as if it came from a dark, forgotten place. The storm outside the house intensified, and the wind howled through the trees surrounding the house, while its eerie laugh echoed throughout. Every time Alex tried to run, he saw that horrifying smile and those unblinking eyes watching him, as if they were following him endlessly. Alex, thinking that things had calmed down a little, turned to run again. But suddenly, he found that the doors and windows had been tightly shut around him, as if the house had decided to trap him. When he turned, the terrifying creature was standing only a step away, its gleaming eyes radiating something akin to hunger. Alex began to scream, but he felt a cold hand grip his neck, preventing him from moving or crying out. He had no strength left, feeling as though his soul was being slowly pulled away, as if life itself was slipping away from his body. In a terrifying moment, the creature gave Alex one last glance, then whispered in a hoarse, threatening voice, "You were just the beginning." Alex's heart stopped beating, his eyes gradually fading, while the strange creature disappeared into the shadows of the room. The house remained eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. When his grandmother returned the next morning, she found the house strangely abandoned, with no trace of Alex anywhere. On a cold October night, Elena, the 18-year-old girl, was wandering alone in the outskirts of the small town after attending a Halloween party with her friends. The air was heavy, and the sky was overcast, and as she began walking toward her home, she realized she had taken the wrong path. She wasn't exactly sure how she ended up in that dark, desolate area, but the curiosity and the strange calm that surrounded her made her continue walking. As she walked, she began to hear faint whispers, like distant voices coming from an indeterminate place. The whispers weren't just the sounds of the wind, but rather, they sounded like people talking, or perhaps whispering in a low, eerie tone. Elena tried to ignore the sounds and quickened her pace, but suddenly, she noticed something strange at the side of the road. There was a small light, like a candle glowing from inside the window of an old cabin, a deserted house that had appeared suddenly between the thick trees, as if it had been waiting for her for a long time. The place seemed to be calling her, inviting her to come closer. Though her heart was pounding, she paused for a moment to gaze at the cabin. Something inside her told her not to approach, but curiosity was stronger, so she took a small step toward the weathered wooden door. Just before she reached it, she felt a cold touch on her shoulder, as if someone was standing behind her. Elena froze in place, too afraid to turn around, but a faint, whispering voice murmured her name. "Elena!" Elena froze in place, her breaths quickening, and when she turned around in fear to see who had touched her shoulder, she found no one. There was nothing but the cold wind beginning to stir the trees gently around her. She tried to convince herself that it was perhaps just the tension or her imagination, brought on by the strange atmosphere and desolate place. But before she could turn to leave, a faint creaking sound came from the wooden door of the cabin. The old holes in the door seemed to groan, as if they were speaking, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a dark, shadowy entrance. She hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear, so she took a deep breath and stepped inside the cabin. The air was thick with an old, musty smell, and dust filled the space. A faint light emanated from an old candle set on a wooden shelf next to the door, as if it had been used recently, even though the place seemed entirely abandoned. As she stepped further into the room, she noticed old drawings on the walls and words carved with sharp tools. The words were incomprehensible, written in a strange, eerie language, but the letters were large and clear, as if someone had written them with determination, leaving them to remain forever. Elena approached a wall with an old picture, its frame decaying with age. The picture was of a woman with wide eyes and an unsettling look that suggested malice. It seemed as though the woman was staring directly at her, as if her eyes moved to follow Elena's steps. Elena tried to look away from the picture, but she felt an unusual coldness in the room with each step she took forward. Then, she saw something else in the far corner of the room. A large pumpkin, carved into a devilish smiling face, its eyes unevenly etched, making it appear as though it was watching her intently. Though the pumpkin didn't move, Elena felt as if she caught a faint glimmer in its eyes, and began to feel an unnatural tension. She moved closer, slowly, trying to convince herself that it was just an abandoned decoration, perhaps left over from a past Halloween. But in the moment she drew nearer, she noticed torn pieces of paper on the ground beside the pumpkin, with strange words written in faded red ink, as if they had dried up long ago. The words seemed to be a warning, saying, "Whoever enters here must not look back." Elena froze, and faint whispers began to echo again from within the walls, like distant voices warning her, screaming without sound, "Elena, leave, leave." After reading the warning written next to the pumpkin, Elena felt an overwhelming pressure pulling her toward the door. But before she could move, she noticed for a moment that the terrifying pumpkin began to shake slowly, swaying as though it were a living creature trying to escape its place. Its carved eyes began to glow with an eerie red light, and its drawn smile gradually transformed into an open mouth, revealing sharp, twisted teeth. Elena recoiled in horror, but she stumbled and fell to the ground. When she lifted her head, she saw the pumpkin hopping and moving toward her slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as if it knew exactly where she was. Elena ran toward the door, her breaths quickening and her heart pounding louder. When she looked behind her, she saw dozens of similar pumpkins emerging throughout the room. Their sizes ranged from small to large, but all of them had the same glowing eyes and predatory mouths, relentlessly moving toward her. With all her strength, Elena ran to the old kitchen inside the cabin, found a worn-out matchbox, struck one of the matches, and threw it onto the floor covered in straw and dry wood. The fire ignited quickly, flames erupting throughout the cabin. But the pumpkins didn't stop. They began multiplying even more, emerging from the walls and ceiling, ignoring the flames as if they were unaffected. Elena fled the cabin swiftly, a chill overtaking her body, but the real shock came when she saw the pumpkins flowing out of the cabin like a river of terror, some rolling on the ground, others leaping into the air toward her. The sky seemed darker than usual, with gray clouds filling the sky, while shadows danced from the light left by the flames. As she ran at full speed along the old dirt road leading to the outskirts of the town, a strange old man appeared before her, his features distorted and his clothes torn as if they were from another time. He raised a heavy staff and lunged at the first pumpkin that came close to Elena, striking it with such force that it exploded. But he didn't know that this act would ignite the wrath of the other pumpkins. Suddenly, hundreds of pumpkins gathered around him and began to devour him in a horrific way, some clinging to his feet while others jumped onto his body. Amidst his terrifying screams, he disappeared among the savage pumpkins. Elena couldn't bear to look, her heart screaming in terror as her blood froze in her veins. There was nothing left for her but to flee. She ran through the fields and dark trees, the old whispers still echoing in her ears, but this time, they were whispers pleading and screaming, begging her not to stop. With each step, the terrifying sound of rolling pumpkins grew louder, and low, eerie laughter echoed from the depths, resonating in the air. Elena ran without stopping, and the farther she got from the cabin, the more she felt as if she were escaping a terrifying nightmare. But the pumpkins wouldn't leave her. They followed her, multiplying in every corner, like an army of dark creatures. The air around her was suffocating, and the black sky covered her as if conspiring with those creatures. She could hear the sound of the pumpkins rolling behind her, getting closer and closer, until it seemed like they were about to devour her. Just when she was about to lose hope, she spotted a faint light through the trees in the distance. It was her house, the old house where she had lived her whole life. It looked strange, as if something had changed in it, but at that moment all that mattered was reaching safety. She entered the house, slammed the door behind her quickly, and stood still in the darkness, unable to breathe. Everything was silent, and all she could hear was the sound of her heart pounding clearly in the deadly silence. But suddenly, she heard something in the dark corner of the room. She turned and saw faint lights dancing in the darkness. As she got closer, she realized that the pumpkins had followed her into the house, just like they had entered the room. They were rolling on the floor, opening their hideous mouths, laughing softly, as if they knew they had one. At that moment, Elena realized that escaping had been futile. The house itself had become part of the nightmare. There was no chance of survival. The whispers began to chase her in every corner. But just as she felt she was about to collapse, the pumpkins lunged at her with terrifying speed, yet she froze in place. Before any of them could get closer, she felt the cold creeping into her heart, and her eyes began to close little by little. Then, suddenly, all the pumpkins stopped, gathered in a corner of the room, and began to fade away as if they had been an illusion, leaving Elena in the silent darkness, wondering if everything that had happened was just a nightmare, or if the horror she had experienced had been real. However, she didn't have the courage to look behind her. The laughter faded, and the room became completely still, as if that night had never happened. But had she truly survived? On one cold October night, four 15-year-old friends were wandering in a small, remote town in the northern United States. The town was empty, its buildings abandoned and its alleys dark. The streets were littered with scattered leaves, and the wind howled through the dense trees surrounding the area. It seemed as if the town had been left for many years, as if it had been swallowed by isolation and darkness. Tom, Jake, Alex, and Michael were on an unplanned exploration trip after hearing about this town from one of the mysterious stories passed around by locals. They arrived at the town's outskirts at sunset, where the lights were dim and the sky was turning a deep red, as if it were a warning sign. As they walked through the dark streets, they began to feel something strange in the air. Every step they took made a faint sound on the asphalt, as if the place was groaning under their feet. But what was strange was that the town was completely silent. There were no bird sounds, no car noises, not even the usual whispers of the wind. The atmosphere was filled with a sense of dread. Then suddenly they saw something in the distance. It was an old, tall house standing out amidst the abandoned town. It seemed like a relic of the past, with shattered windows and half-open doors. Tom was the first to notice the house and said quietly, "Should we go there?" Michael, staring at the house, smiled slightly, feeling strangely drawn to it. "I like this place. Let's check it out." But as they approached the house, the sense of fear grew. The windows were covered in dust, some of the walls were crumbling, and a foul smell was coming from inside the house. Despite this, none of them could turn back. Tom, who had been going through a tough time in his life, began to feel something strange inside him, and something made him feel uneasy. Then, suddenly, without any apparent reason, he burst into tears. He cried bitterly, as if something painful was pressing on his heart. Alex and Jake stood frozen, one of them asking, "Tom, what's wrong? Why are you crying? You're a man." Jake tried to calm him down, but Tom cried uncontrollably, unable to explain why. He felt a heavy weight in his chest, as if the memories or fear he was experiencing in this town had taken hold of him in a strange way. Alex, who was calmer, said, "We won't stop here, Tom. We're here with you. This is just an abandoned town, and we need to be brave." but it was clear that everyone was beginning to feel uneasy. Tom, who couldn't control his tears, felt that something in this place was digging into his soul. At that moment, they all felt something stirring in the dark within the house. It was a strange sound, like the rustling from within the walls, followed by faint whispers as if they were coming from the depths of the place. They all stood frozen, staring at the door of the house, which began to open slowly. Tom suddenly stopped crying, as if he had awoken from a strange state, and then started laughing loudly. His laughter sounded unnatural, as though something had taken control of him. His laughter echoed through the dark town, causing the rest of the friends to freeze in place, stunned. Alex looked at him in confusion and asked, "What's wrong with you, Tom? Why are you laughing now?" Meanwhile, Jake, who had started to feel scared, spoke in a low voice, "Are you okay? This is not the time to laugh." But Tom continued laughing hysterically, unable to stop. His laughter grew louder, and he smiled in a strange way, as though something in the place had taken over his mind. Then, suddenly, the laughter turned into frantic agitation. Michael, who could no longer bear the situation, stepped toward him and said angrily, "Stop it, Tom!" He slapped him, trying to quiet him. But instead of backing down or calming down, Tom's laughter grew even more, becoming even more insane. Alex, who felt something uneasy in the air, tried to separate them, saying, "Enough! Stop it!" But in a sudden burst of anger, Tom hit Michael in the face with his fist, leading to a violent fight between the three of them. They were wrestling at that moment, unable to understand why they were behaving this way. The atmosphere was chaotic and charged with tension, as if the place itself was provoking them and pressing down on them. As they fought, something strange began happening on the second floor of the house. The light that had been engulfed in darkness suddenly started to flicker. The lights flashed for brief moments, then went out only to light up again and then go dark once more. This constant flickering of the lights signaled something unnatural. The friends stopped fighting and looked up toward the second floor. The lights flickered rapidly, as though inviting them to go up there, but also warning them of something dark lurking. They were all trembling, and anxiety began to creep into their hearts. Tom, who had finally stopped laughing, turned pale and said in a trembling voice, "There's something up there, something dangerous." Jake, who was more composed, whispered, "We need to leave now." But Michael stared at the flashing lights again, feeling a strange pull towards the second floor. "I need to know what's happening up there." As they debated what to do, the lights on the second floor added to the eerie atmosphere with their strange, intermittent flashes. The whispering sound returned, this time louder and closer. It seemed as though the creatures hiding in the shadows were starting to warn them. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble slightly, and as they approached the entrance of the house, the lights on the second floor grew brighter, but they resembled warning signals, as though they were cautioning them to stay away. The whispers began turning into louder and more intense sounds, as if something or someone was watching them from above. As they approached the interior door of the house, the whispers turned into terrifying sounds, like moans coming from the depths. Suddenly, as they stared into the darkness, a deep and loud voice echoed from the first floor, filled with power and menace. A ghost appeared in the dark corner of the room, its body transparent as if light could not penetrate it. It wore old, tattered clothes, and its eyes were completely empty, like two endless dark holes. The ghost bellowed, "Why didn't you go up to the second floor?" Its voice was filled with hostility, as though the final word had supernatural power. The ghost moved toward them with unnatural speed, and in an instant, its transparent hands reached out and struck Michael hard on the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The strike sounded like thunder, and Michael felt something heavy in his chest, as though the air itself had become suffocating. "You like this place?" the ghost mocked, then raised a long hand and pointed to the second floor. Its steps were invisible, but it began to ascend the stairs lightly, as if the ground under its feet made no sound. Tom, who had begun to panic, started crying again. Tears streamed down his face, and he cried bitterly, as if his heart ached for something he couldn't understand. "I want to get out! I want to get out!" he screamed, while Jake, his eyes full of fear, said in a trembling voice, "Tom, Michael, we have to get out of here. This place is haunted. We need to leave now." Alex, who was trying to stay calm, looked at Michael and said, "Michael, what are you doing? If this place is haunted, we need to escape." But Michael, staring at the second floor with the whispers growing louder, seemed as if he had lost his mind. "I'm not leaving this place. I have to go up there," Michael answered firmly. Without lifting his gaze from the stairs, Michael took Tom by the hand and said, "You're not going. I'm going to the second floor. We'll find out what's going on up there." But Alex noticed something strange in his eyes, as if his determination had suddenly shifted into something darker. Jake, feeling overwhelming anxiety, couldn't bear it any longer. "I can't stay here," he screamed and ran toward the door. But when he opened it, there was a loud noise like a gunshot, as if something had struck him directly. Alex, hearing the sound, felt a fire ignite in his heart. He ran to the door and found Jake lying on the ground, his eyes wide open in shock, blood pouring from him. Although Jake had been far from them, it seemed as though someone had shot him in a strange way. Alex tried to scream, but no words came from his mouth. As Alex ran outside, he felt a heavy sensation gnawing at his heart, a feeling of being watched. Then, suddenly, a strange figure appeared in front of him, lacking a face, or rather, its face was dark, as if shadows had swallowed it. The figure quickly approached him and grabbed Alex in a vice-like grip, choking him until he lost consciousness. Inside the house, as Michael approached the second floor, he felt something wrap around his neck, as if an unseen hand was choking him, preventing him from breathing. He gasped for air, his voice unable to make a sound. Finally, Michael choked, falling to the ground, his body trembling while the ghostly whispers grew louder around him. As for Tom, who had felt something strange within him after separating from the others, he felt an unnatural calmness seep into him. His tears had stopped, and his eyes were filled with a dark gaze. Suddenly, he felt something leaving his body, and his eyes became completely empty. His body gradually turned transparent, dissolving into the air, becoming part of the place itself. Tom, who had lived through the nightmare all night, was now a part of this haunted house. His story had ended, but the house, now darker than ever, whispered in the winds, continuing to move between new souls.